Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, Charlie Coven and his team, who were very generous with their time and attention, and to gratefully acknowledge NSF's Critical Zone Observatory Program, which funded this research, the UC Natural Reserve System, which hosted this research, and the US Department of Energy for additional research funds. I also want to warmly acknowledge Ryan Madden and several others in the SBIM department for extraordinary support of my journey as a student parent. And of course, major thanks go to Inez for everything I've already mentioned and more, the constant expert guidance and problem solving and encouragement at every stage of both this research and the rest of my PhD experience. So thank you all for your generosity and contributions. The topic of this research is the influence of microclimates on tree transpiration. And the motivation for this topic comes from our need to anticipate changing patterns of vegetation vulnerability under the stresses of climate change. In Mediterranean climates like California, the how, when, and why of trees transporting water from the soil to the atmosphere, which is illustrated here at right, is a matter of life and death for the trees. And this is determined by both plant physiology, the height of the tree, the number of leaves, and so forth, and the physical climate that a tree inhabits, which supplies both its resources for growth and also sets the price for that growth. But what's missing from this picture is a sense of how trees may change or adapt any number of their water regulating features illustrated here to live or die under a new climate. So in our study, we wanted to figure out what the present day forest could teach us about the innate adaptability of trees. And in particular, we wanted to ask, how much variation in physical climate do trees contend with across even very small distances apart in the landscapes that they inhabit? For example, how strong are the microclimate differences within a soccer pitch's worth of hilly terrain? And how do those feed forward into the variation in water fluxes demanded from the trees? And secondly, at this fine spatial scale, among tree neighbors who are all experiencing the same weather events and growing on the same rocks and soil, how much adaptability do trees exhibit in their unique microclimates? So to pick a tree subject to focus on, we bypassed the largest and most common species in the forest, Douglas firs and oaks, in favor of Pacific madrones. And this choice was informed by previous research showing that Pacific madrones have the most risky water use strategy in the forest, reaching their peak water fluxes quite a bit later and under drier conditions than other species, which you can see in this middle panel of the graph here. So this made them particularly interesting to investigate for adaptability. And now to zoom past 2.5 years of planning and 5 a.m. field trips and the installation of around 100 sensors, during which all my technologies were vital in helping me along the way, I ultimately arrived at this setup. And clockwise from lower right here, I was measuring soil moisture, air temperature and humidity in 2 different configurations, solar radiation from an adjacent meadow, and lastly, the key observation in the trees themselves was the measure of sap velocity, or the speed of water that moves up the tree trunks, out the leaves, which is pictured at the lower left. And this is a map of the sensors with sap flow instrumented madrones shown as red dots, temperature and humidity measurements shown as yellow stars, and the solar sensor over in the meadow is this little green triangle high in the upper left, pardon me. And the soil moisture sensors are shown as blue diamonds. So because these sensors drape across 2 opposing hill faces, this setup allowed the observation of 2 distinct microclimates that each hosted a population of Pacific madrone trees. And the measurements happened continuously at 5-minute intervals, and our data set spans 3 years, although today we're only focusing on 5 summer months in 2018. So to dive into the data, the first result that we got was a measure of the microclimatic variation between these hill slopes, generated purely by the differences in sunlight consistently received by each slope. So to anticipate how this works, on the left is a bare ground rendering of the site, while the right shows a LiDAR cross-section of the site with the vegetation on top in green. And above that, I've drawn 2 solar arcs for different moments in the season. The lower arc is the end of October, and generally also the end of the dry season. Oh, there's my cursor, okay. And the higher arc here is the summer solstice when the north slope gets the most sunlight. And this is an example of what these sunlight differences look like between the slope. This is a south minus north drawing of a typical daily cycle. And something that I didn't expect before I drew this picture for myself on the upper right is that some months the north actually gets more light than the south in the late afternoon. And it doesn't symmetrically do that in the morning because of both the slight westward tilt of these hill slopes and because higher up the ridge to the east, the hill increases in elevation and this blocks out the morning time sunlight. So I just highlight this to get us all on the same page about how much the topography is really driving this pattern. And these sunlight differences drive different ambient air temperatures and water vapor pressure deficits. So the adjacent hill slopes turn out to be quite distinct microclimates, with the south being in some hotter and drier throughout the summer and early autumn. And the lower the solar arc gets in the sky towards the end of autumn, the more pronounced these differences become. And as you'd expect, water fluxes from trees do respond to these different microclimates. So these charts are showing a climatology difference between the slopes, but if we look at the full time series of our sat flow data, we can see another interesting difference, which is that for most of the summer, the south sap velocities in orange are peaking at faster velocities than the north in blue, until the autumn when the north peak velocity is faster. So this is beginning to hint at some different relationships between climate and water use. So returning to our slope difference climatologies, if we look at all 5 months of the summer season and not just July, we see the seasonal progression of microclimate differences and how they relate to water use. The cross slope differences in sat velocity are peaking here in July, even though October sees microclimate differences that are stronger. And the corresponding daily sat flow cycles on each slope show that the water use differences caused here are both a result of timing differences in the daily cycle and evolving bulk transpiration over the summer. That is, July experiences much faster sat velocities than October, but throughout the summer, the longer solar exposure on the south slope causes the hot and dry part of the day to persist there for more hours. And the absolute magnitude of water use differences we computed by integrating under each of these curves, giving a volume of water transpired per unit area of sapwood area that exists within the cross sections of the tree trunks. It's a little hard to wrap your head around, but the numbers on the top of the bottom row of plots here are the percentage differences that we observed between these two slopes for each month. And the fact that they're all positive shows that the trees on the south are consistently releasing more water than those on the north. Even in September and October, when the higher resolution time series shows faster peak sat velocities on the north, the longer day lengths of the south are more than compensating for this. So to give you an actual amount of water to visualize, in July, the south slope madrones are moving a column of water through their trunks, nearly 1.4 meters deep, while the north slope madrones correspondingly are moving a column of water 1.1 meters deep. And once we arrive in October, the trees on both slopes are using less than 25% of the water that they use at their peak. So this answers my first question by showing that the amount of climate variation between the hill slopes is big enough to produce these substantial differences in transpiration flux. But as for our second question, we need something more, because it's expected that even without any acclimation in their physical features, that trees would use different amounts of water in such different climates. So to answer my second question, whether the trees are indeed using water in functionally distinct ways, I needed to quantify and compare how the environment drives water use on each slope separately. So I developed a model to do this. And our model here predicts sat velocity response to environmental drivers, which are shown in blue, using 9 fitted parameters, which are shown in red. We included a response function for vapor pressure deficit, for soil moisture, and for sunlight. And in the case of vapor pressure deficit and sunlight, I added in some time shifted terms to reflect the delay in the response of sat velocity to these variables, to basically reflect the fact that the column of water within the tree has some amount of inertia and it remembers what was going on a couple of hours ago. So after fitting the parameters, which are shown in red here, twice, once for the north slope and once for the south slope using an MCMC process, I arrived at 2 distinct models for sat velocity validated against withheld data that characterize the environmental response of sat velocity to environment on each slope. And to compare the parametric differences between the north slopes model and the south slopes model, I plotted the environmental response expressions for each variable separately. So here in the top two panels, for example, I've taken a typical VPD daily cycle shown here on the left, and I've run it through the response expression for the north slope model and the south slope model separately to arrive at these purple and orange lines. And I've done the same with the soil moisture response and the sunlight response. And this gives us a view of what the models are telling us about environmental sensitivities and how they differ between the two slopes. So the models are showing here that north slope trees are more responsive to vapor pressure deficit, while the south is more responsive to sunlight. And something really intriguing that surprised us is that the north model here in purple didn't find any soil moisture limitation in its transpiration response, even at the very end of the dry season, which we can see because there's no decline in this expression over the whole range of observed values, which is denoted by this shadowed region here. In contrast, the south slope model in orange does show a strong constraint from soil moisture decline under roughly 10% volumetric soil water content. And just a clarification that I like to share because it gives us a sense of how cool these ecosystems actually are. The values on the x-axis of the soil moisture plot here are representing only the surface soil moisture, but we do expect that the total root zone moisture that the trees have access to is much greater than these numbers would suggest. Research that took place on the north slope of this site showed that there's a reservoir of water in weathered bedrock that the roots can draw from up to depths of 10 or 11 meters. So even though the message of this panel is that statistically, water supply is not a limiting factor of north slope transpiration flux, while on the south slope it is, it's worth clarifying that the actual amount of water supply that each slope's population has access to is unknown. So in sum, I interpreted this to be evidence of acclimation within the two populations of trees because they are not behaving functionally the same way. Their water flux response to their ambient climatic drivers is fairly different, as these plots are showing. So just to rephrase question 2, do trees physically adapt their features regulating water use in order to customize their water use to the climate they inhabit? Yes, they do. But in order to get at the part of the question that asks how much they do this or how big a difference this really is, we did another experiment, a computational experiment, where we gave each version of our model identical environmental conditions. So here I chose the average July environmental conditions of both the south and north slopes for inputs. So first we're seeing the difference between the models when reacting to the same south slope environment. And in black here, we have the real observed south slope sap velocity for July. And then in dotted red, we have the model which matches these observations, which in this case is the south slopes model being fed the south slope conditions. But soaring above that in dotted green, we have the north slope model being fed the south slope conditions. And as you can see, it's vastly overestimating transpiration in these conditions. So basically, if the south slope trees behaved the same way as the north slope trees, they'd actually be moving much more water relative to the north slope than the observations actually show. And correspondingly, if we investigate the opposite scenario, namely we give both models the north climate conditions, then we see these differences. So again, we have the observations here in black, and in this case, dotted red is representing the north slope model being fed the north climate conditions, which is doing a fairly good job of predicting our observations. And underneath this, in the dotted green, we have the south slope model fed the north slope conditions, and you can see it's predicting a much more conservative water response. So this exemplifies the cumulative impact of all the parameter differences between these two models. And we hypothesize that this looks consistent with the idea that south slope trees actually use water relatively sparingly through stomatal control due to their greater sun exposure and eventual water limitation by the end of the summer. And this is the case even though they wind up using more water because of the longer day lengths that they're exposed to. And in contrast, the north trees, which live in relatively dim light environments with shorter day lengths, we hypothesize spend their water much more profitably to conduct enough photosynthesis in their dimmer light environment. So in sum, this could be explained as differences in water use efficiency, and we hypothesize that that's what's going on. And consequently, we expect that these two populations will react to shifting climate conditions of water limitations in the future in different ways. So the key findings from this work are that solar radiation differences do drive substantial microclimate gradients across adjacent north and south facing slopes. And that in the mid latitudes where these microclimate differences are especially strong, this is a determinant of substantial variation in water fluxes across the landscape. And lastly, the finding that I'm most excited about is that we've actually measured distinct relationships between water use sensitivity and inhabited microclimate that show us that Pacific madrone trees have a degree of physical adaptability, one which is large enough to influence the estimation of water fluxes in a given climate by upwards of 15%. So this opens up new avenues to understanding or anticipating the patchworked vulnerability of trees to future novel climate regimes or water limitations. Thank you very much for listening, and I'd be happy to take any questions if there's time.
Great presentation, Eren. I really liked all the modeling and yeah, my question is whether you can talk a little bit more about how this variation would apply, thinking about climate resilience, especially given that the trees are not, they can't move. So what do you think about their the variation between the different slopes and how that will in the future with climate resilience?
Thank you for the question. I think that the stresses that the trees will endure in the future will interact with the physical features that are illustrated here to determine the vulnerability of the trees to those climate stresses. And the time scale of the stress that they experience is a big determinant of whether the stress is too much for them or whether they can shift. These mechanisms all have the ability to change at really different time scales. So a stomatal response in a tree can happen on the order of minutes. Biochemical changes, sorry about that, in the leaves can happen on the order of weeks. And trees can adjust their whole canopies every year, or if they have very long leaf lifespans, perhaps up to every 4 years. But other processes take longer. You know, it might take decades for a tree to change its branching structure or change its height, get taller. So I think that this research opens up ways for us to get hooks into the question you're asking, but we would still need to dial down a little bit into the type of stress we were investigating and the type of tree we were trying to anticipate the response of. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that was a really poorly phrased question, but you answered exactly what I was hoping you would answer.
Thank you.
Hi, do you hear me? Can you?
Yes.
My name is Ignacio Chapela. I have two questions that I hope are related. The first one is, I wonder how much you can push your models to show not only the flexibility, you know, the plasticity of function, but also the limits of possibility. I wonder what you think about, so I think you demonstrate that there is plasticity in function and that there is real adaptation. But I also wonder how much you feel your tools are useful to establish the limits, the boundaries of how far this will go. And the second question would be if you would care to comment about, I imagine that you're building up this data to try and feed larger scale models at the landscape level. And I wonder how you think about different species and whether you would need to do this for many different species, or will you go just conifers and broadleaves, or what are your feelings of also the limits of you know, taxonomic or phylogenetic limits of your models?
Thank you for those questions. Yeah, I agree with you. Those are definitely the things to inform future research. Your first question about how much we can use this model to identify the limits of adaptation is on point. And the answer to that is because this model doesn't resolve any of these individual mechanisms, we can't really use it to differentiate the timescales of response or the limits of those responses. But I think that this research is a good argument for developing such a model where you could play with carbon and water economy of a tree if it were to totally redo its canopy, for example, with a new set of leaves with different photosynthetic properties. So this model cannot do that, but I think that it's a good argument for developing one that can. And the second question about whether or not this model result applies beyond the species, I think it hints at the fact that, I mean, trees have some features in common. They're all working with features that are, roughly represented here on this chart. So whatever mechanisms are at play, which we can only speculate about, but whatever mechanisms are at play could very well be at play in other tree species as well. But right now, the computational landscape that this research is speaking to uses plant functional types rather than individual species to examine the responses of vegetation to future climate. And so we would need to add in, I think, some envelope of variability in these water regulating features in order to examine the variation of the responses in those plant functional types. And as for whether we need to refine the categories of the plant functional types, I think that is always a conversation that is happening. And as far as I know right now, it is more or less limited by our ability to compete plant functional types in a realistic way. But yeah, perhaps Inez or somebody else would know more about those research directions.
Eren, you can talk about your work with Fates, with Charlie.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so Fates is a model that does actually try and compete these plant functional types, which is sort of where I was drawing that information from. So Fates does allow some of these physical features to change, for instance, the heights of the trees and consequently whether they're in an overstory or understory light environment. But there's a lot of nuance that it's currently not represented, and research development to put those processes in is underway. It's a really vibrant research group. They're trying out lots of different things, but I think these things are still in development.
And I would add, we need more data so that we can inform the models.
Very true. Yeah.
So thank you very much. That's all the time for the questions we have, but thank you for such a fabulous presentation, generating so much interest. Let's give it up for Eren. Thank you for joining us.